A few years ago, my wife and I were lucky enough to go to the Holy Land over in Israel. Although I had spent over a decade teaching and writing about the scriptures related to Palestine and other places in the Old and New Testament, I had never actually seen the Judean desert or the shores of the Sea of Galilee. When I got there, I was blown away at the green lushness of the Galilean Valley and the barren wilderness where Jesus went and fasted for 40 days. One interesting thing that happened when I got there is I immediately started seeing insights into scriptures that I had never had before. Like, when Jesus resurrects and his apostles are in Jerusalem, he tells the women to go tell the apostles to meet him in Galilee. I had usually just blown past that verse like he was telling them to meet him around the corner. But when you're there, you realize how far away Galilee is from Jerusalem. It's over 100 miles to the north. He was telling them to take a multiple-day journey, to do a lot of work, to go see him as a resurrected being in a place that was a little more safe and secluded than Jerusalem was. I gained a new insight from knowing the geography. Another neat one that happened was we were in a bus and I was with a local tour guide, and I mentioned something that we were getting ready to go to Jerusalem. The tour guide turned to me and he said, "Brother Sweat, when we say that we're going to Jerusalem, we always say we're going up to Jerusalem." He said, because Jerusalem is up in elevation and you have to go up on all sides from the mountains to get there. And it's also symbolic of Jerusalem as like the holy highest city. Well, interestingly enough, later that night, I happened to be reading in 1 Nephi chapter 3 when Nephi is with his brothers and they have to go return to Jerusalem. But Nephi doesn't say, let's return to Jerusalem. Nephi says, let us go up to Jerusalem. Those are just a few little stories about how a little contextual knowledge can have some large practical meaning and open up understanding that we've never had before. That's why BYU religion professor and scholar Lincoln Blumell, who is just a genius as an early Christianity scholar, helped to put together and edit a fascinating study companion book for readers of the New Testament to better help them grasp the text, the culture, and the history.
You know, the context for the Gospels is in large part rural Galilee. You know, the context for Paul's letters are in large part large Greco-Roman cities, you know, in some cases. And these are two, even though they're roughly the same time period, first century, but these are in some ways worlds apart. If somebody is aware of those, and that's why there's some chapters on these, I think you'll read the New Testament and maybe be aware of some things that you otherwise might be liable to miss.
Well, so that we aren't liable to miss, on today's episode, Dr. Lincoln Blumell will take us into the world of the New Testament. He'll help us better understand the history, the culture, the geography, and other factors related to the New Testament, so that as we better understand the background of the texts, we can better understand the deeper meanings and insights within those texts. I'm your host, Professor Anthony Sweat, and this is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Recently, Professor Ryan Sharp sat down with his ancient scripture colleague, Professor Lincoln Blumell, to talk about his recent book publication, The New Testament, History, Culture, and Society, a background to the texts of the New Testament. In part one, Professor Blumell will cover why he did this volume, including some of the general background and the intertestamental period. He'll talk and hone in more specifically on the King James Version of the text, sharing some examples of how early textual analysis and textual criticism can change some potential meaning of some of the verses of the New Testament. He gives some fascinating insights on verses related to Gethsemane and also a few verses related to the Trinity. In part two, he moves more into why some of this scholarship matters. And in part three, as always, he'll get a little more personal, telling us why he chose to be a religion professor and why he chooses faith. So without any further delay, here is Ryan Sharp interviewing Lincoln Blumell.
So Lincoln, we're here to talk about your recent publication, an edited volume entitled New Testament History, Culture, and Society, and then the subtitle, A Background to the Text of the New Testament. So this volume is divided into 7 sections, contains 43 chapters, and has 836 total pages. The first question I want to ask is, what in the world motivated such a massive project? Maybe just take a minute to talk with us about the genesis of the project and how you were able to pull it off.
I knew that, it was a few years before the New Testament cycle was coming up. And I thought it'd be nice to have a book that was kind of more like a handbook. One of the things I'm seeing, they're being a lot more popular in the academy are these handbooks on a topic where they're, it's not a book that's designed to really read from cover to cover. You kind of pick and choose different, has like about a number of different facets to one topic. And I hadn't really seen anything like this for Latter-day Saints that had a distinctly LDS approach to the New Testament. I've seen things kind of comparable out in the academy on the New Testament. And so I began thinking, and the first thing was, okay, well, what would I like in this book? There were actually many more than, the 40-odd chapters here. In fact, it was up around 60-something chapters. But I realized not long after I went to publishers that wasn't really going to be tenable to do that. And so had 40-something chapters and thought, well, we're still missing a lot, but I think this gives a nice, good overview of what's out there. And so then it was just a matter of, okay, what do I like? And then start, who are the people, both here at BYU. Most of the authors are colleagues at BYU, but also Latter-day Saints elsewhere. Some are, graduate students who are almost finishing. There are a couple colleagues at other universities. And then I approached some even outside of the building. And so that was kind of how it began. And it was a lot of work. I think you give people deadlines, and I gave a lot of time for that and eventually got everything in. But in the end, I was happy with everything.
Yeah. Oh, it's wonderful. I want to eventually get to the section on the text of the New Testament where you actually have a couple of articles, one that you co-authored and one that you did yourself. But before we do, maybe just in terms of some historical context, let me recap something and then ask a question. So around 587, 586 BC, Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar overtake Judah and take many of the Jews into captivity. This period is often referred to as Babylonian captivity or the exilic period. Think Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, etc. Then sometime around 539, 538 BC, King Cyrus and the Persians conquer Babylon and restore the Jews to their homeland, like Nehemiah, Ezra, etc. This leads to a period of relative religious freedom for the Jews. So we end the Old Testament with Jews having relative religious freedom under Persia, but when we start the New Testament, Jews are ruled by Romans. There's a Roman named Herod who is functioning as king of the Jews, and Scripture is now written in Greek. What happened?
What happened? Well, there's a lot, that happened with the Old Testament. As it ends, it's just you're one of, they're really a Persian, satrapy, one of 519 Persian provinces, right? Judah, and they've rebuilt the temple, and then as we get to the New Testament, probably if I were going to summarize, in this nearly half a millennium, some of the most important things that take place. Without a doubt, it would be the rise of the Macedonian Empire under Alexander the Great. Beginning in the 330s BC, where he begins to push back against the Persian, goes into modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, and is incredibly successful in a number of battles over a relatively short period of time, and then will very decisively, beat back the Persians. And effectively, it's in a matter of time before Alexander will basically become master of the former Persian territories, which is huge, which spans all the way from modern-day Turkey, east out, towards Babylon, down into Egypt. And while he conquers these areas, one of the things he does is he Hellenizes them, where he introduces, Greek ideas, Greek, philosophy, begins to creep in. People begin to engage with that. But the biggest single thing is the language. When Alexander conquers, really for the next 1,000 years, the language of administration, in modern-day Turkey or Asia Minor and Judea, in Egypt, the language of administration is all Greek. It really won't change until the Arab conquest in the 7th century AD. And that is why the New Testament, all the writings of the New Testament are written in Greek. There's stories that, well, maybe Matthew's written in Hebrew or there's other things written in other languages. Well, every piece that we have is written in Greek. And this is really a result of what Alexander does, and because it's the dominant language. When I teach this in a class, I sometimes relate this to, yes, that people be speaking, right, in their regional areas, Egyptian, right, or Aramaic or something like this, but the language that people would speak, if you really want to reach a larger audience, this is like English today, right? This is kind of Greek at the time in that part of the world. And so I think that the gospel writers and others make a good decision, say, let's write in Greek, we're going to reach a much larger audience. And so that's one of the biggest things that really takes place. And then, of course, Rome will then come along and effectively take over in 63 BC. And they'll ultimately make Judea a province in AD 6, but that, of course, then leads to some big changes. But those would be among the two that I'd say really, if somebody is aware of those, and that's why there's some chapters on these, I think you'll read the New Testament and maybe be aware of some things that you otherwise might be liable to miss.
So in addition to the article that you co-authored with Dr. Martin, you also wrote a chapter on the Greek New Testament text of the King James Version, in which you discuss, among other things, textual criticism. So will you summarize for our listeners textual criticism, what it is, and then the value behind identifying textual variants?
Yeah, what it is basically is, when we look at, we have all these manuscripts of the New Testament, right? Some more modern. When I say more modern, they maybe only be 500 years old, and some more ancient, where we have, fairly long chunks of the New Testament that go back as early as the 3rd century, and we get complete Bibles of the New Testament from the 4th century. And what you notice when you begin to look at all these manuscripts that when you take two manuscripts that have a fairly long portion, no two manuscripts ever read the same, right? One verse might, drop out something, one verse might add something. And for the most part, when you think about these differences, and there are literally tens of thousands of differences, and the same could be said in many ways with the Old Testament, although we don't have as much data for the Old Testament. Most of these differences are fairly minor, right? Somebody adds a definite article, drops a definite article, a conjunction, things like that. But I would probably say when you get down to about 5 to 10% become more significant. There's some that are less than 5% that become really significant, where they change the theological meaning of a passage. And so what then the work of a text critic is, when you have all these manuscripts and they have different readings and they're actually meaningful, maybe doctrinally or theologically, is what is the best reading for this? I think something else that comes out of this, especially for Latter-day Saints, I would say, is it becomes very clear, and I don't want to overstate this, but at a certain level, there is definitely at times deliberate alteration of the New Testament. It's not just, somebody was a careless scribe and they recopied things. And again, I think you have to frame this by saying, we're dealing with manuscripts in an age before the printing press and for any modern technologies, where if you want to copy something, you got to write it out by hand. And I tell my students, say, this isn't easy. If you don't believe me, well, just copy out the New Testament. Go copy it out, in a notebook and see how well you copy it. And probably inevitably you're going to drop a verse, miss a verse here and there as you skip around.
Especially without spaces, right? Because the original text didn't have spaces.
There's no spaces. There's things like that. And so it's a hard, task. And a lot of scribes historically did the best they could. They made some errors, but there are also clear some passages where there's some deliberately people have gone in and messed around with the text. And so I just kind of give some examples of various texts. And I only give a handful. I could have given many more. In fact, one of the ones that is probably in the Gospels, and I don't even bring it up in the book, that is clearly has the most variance, and clearly it's people are deliberately altering this, is Jesus' teaching on divorce. Both in the Sermon on the Mount and Matthew 19, it's very clear that early scribes, some of them don't like what he's saying, and so there's all kinds of variance there. But among the variants that I do bring up here, I'll just mention a couple of them. But one of the ones I bring up, and this is really interesting, it's Luke chapter 22, verses 43 to 44. And this is the passage where Jesus is in Gethsemane, right? He is suffering, and angels comforting him, and he's actually bleeding. And, we as Latter-day Saints read this as very important, right? We talk about the atonement really beginning in Gethsemane. And of course, we have passages in Doctrine and Covenants or in the Book of Mormon, right? King Benjamin's Discourse that allude to him bleeding and say, okay, it's starting here in Gethsemane. But these are, in fact, the only passages in the New Testament that talk about this. Now, what's interesting is that in a number of modern Bibles, they've omitted these two verses. And what they'll often say, if you look at a note at the bottom of a page where they omit this, they'll have a note that'll say something to the effect of, these verses have been omitted by the editors because they don't appear in a number of ancient manuscripts. And it is true, when you go back and you look at manuscripts, Luke chapter 22, verse 43 and 44, they appear in some and not in others. And I actually wrote a larger article on this, not for Latter-day Saint audience, but for an academic audience, because really the view in the academy is that these verses weren't there in Luke and got added sometime later on. My argument, based on the textual data, was in fact, no, the verses are actually there, but they actually deliberately get removed. And so I make this case. In fact, what was interesting for me is that, in fact, I even found an author who actually said, I know these verses were removed in our day. He says Orthodox writers went and removed them because they didn't understand what was going on.
So what would be the motivation behind removing them?
Well, the author who says this is a Christian bishop in the 4th century, Epiphanius of Salamis in Cyprus. And he talks about Orthodox Christians removing them. And what's interesting here is whenever you have ancient writers allege, well, somebody's corrupting the text, they'll always say it's some heretic's gone and changed this thing. This is the only time in all of ancient Christian literature where he actually says Orthodox people are doing this, meaning those that adhere to the Nicene Creed, they're removing this. And one of the things that's going on, I didn't bring this up in the article, but I think it's clearly the motivation for this, is as I read the Nicene Creed, one of the things that comes out of this, and Christians will address this in various ways later on, I don't believe correctly, but I think it's very clear that when you read the Nicene Creed, you come out of this, and Jesus is an impassible, unalterable being. As it says in the anathema of the Nicene Creed, quote, he's not subject to change or alteration, unquote. And they have Arius in mind, but they're saying basically, as I read this, there is a denial of his humanity. I think when people come and read this about his being comforted by an angel and bleeding, saying this is far too human of Jesus. If this is a deity, why on earth is an angel comforting him?
Yeah, why does a God need help?
Why do you need help? Why is a God suffering? This is not what gods do. They're different than us. And this really seems to be what's going on. There's some other issues at play. But really, if I were to unpack Epiphanius, this is what's going on here. And so then they remove this. And we actually have somebody saying, yeah, they're removing it in our own day. And he said, no, it should have remained. And so the fact that then you have this very, checkered history with this, where it's in some and not in others, I think, well, it's explained really by that passage to some degree. And so my argument is it's actually there because, in fact, in all the early manuscripts, it's there and then it disappears.
Yeah. And then we have it substantiated with restoration texts, the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants.
We have restoration texts. And I also think here, people often look at us who are not Latter-day Saints and say, why do you Latter-day Saints get so hung up on Gethsemane?
Yeah.
Well, if you're using a Bible that doesn't have this passage, you're saying
Fair
there's nothing in
question,
Gethsemane,
yeah.
then you're saying, well, there's nothing there.
Yeah.
And so I think people ought to be aware with this is, yeah, I think there's a far better case that's actually there than not. And so this is why I talk about that just really, really briefly.
Yeah.
The other passage that I think people might find interesting is 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 to 8. And this is what's known, infamously as the Johannine comma. And so you have this passage, right? I'll read this to give some context to it. So it says, verse 7, for there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one. And there are three that bear witness in earth, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood, and these three agree in one. Now, when you read this passage here, it is very, very clear that there's been a large interpolation for the second part of verse 7 and the first part of verse 8. So
and quickly, maybe for our listeners, define interpolation.
An addition, that somebody's gone in and made a deliberate addition to the text. And this begins with in heaven in verse 7 and ends with in earth in verse 8. And so the way that verse 7, 8 really should read is this. For there are three that bear record, the Spirit and the water and the blood, and these three agree in one. There's no reference to Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, right, being one. This got added in much later. It's very clear, a deliberate addition, first in the Latin, and then ultimately got added into the Greek much, much later on. And without going into all the details here, it ended up getting into the Greek text that underlied the King James translation that was produced by Erasmus in his third edition. He included this reading. And so it's there. But in fact, if you go to every modern translation, they've now removed it. And I think it's really interesting because this is clearly, it's the closest thing you get to a Trinitarian proof text. And clearly was added for that reason in the Latin and was then included in the Greek. But it has nothing to do with the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost being one. The real point of the passage is, right, is there are three that bear witness, the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And the context here is that Jesus actually is a fleshly or mortal being. In fact, one of the things that's going on there in 1 John is that, in fact, there's a group who are called antichrists who are denying that Jesus came, quote, in the flesh, that he had an actual body. And John begins by saying, look, I've touched him, I've felt him, and he has a body, and these things are testifying of this. And Jesus, obviously, the Holy Ghost put the water in the blood. And I take that as a reference back to John when Jesus is speared by the centurion, and what comes out? Well, water and blood. It's only in the Gospel of John, but it'd be hard if he wasn't actually a mortal being that wouldn't otherwise come out. And so it's interesting how somebody goes and makes this into a Trinitarian proof text, and we retain this in the King James, where I think people ought to know that, in fact, there's no dispute this thing doesn't actually exist. That middle part just got added, and I think it really obfuscates what John's actually getting at, which was Jesus actually was a mortal being while he was here.
If you're interested in more peer-reviewed, high-quality gospel scholarship about Latter-day Saint history, doctrine, or practice, such as this publication, BYU's Religious Studies Center is a great place to check out. As the Collective Church gets ready to study the Doctrine and Covenants and church history in the year 2021, I want to call your attention to the volume from the 2016 Sperry Symposium called Foundations of the Restoration, Fulfillment of the Covenant Purpose. This book is a compilation of essays from the 2016 Sperry Symposium. In this volume, readers will learn how we understand the development of Latter-day Saint theology in the Restoration, how to think about and approach church history and church doctrine, about the beliefs declared in the Articles of Faith and how we apply them, about the development of temples and temple ordinances, and about the restoration of true Sabbath worship. Also included are chapters on some people like W.W. Phelps, or on some ideas like the historical development of sustaining members of the First Presidency and the Council of 12 Apostles as prophets, seers, and revelators. Again, the book is called Foundations of the Restoration, Fulfillment of the Covenant Purpose. It can be a great companion to your 2021 study of Come Follow Me with Church History and Doctrine. Check it out and pick it up at rsc.byu.edu. We've been listening to Professor Lincoln Blumell about his work on his edited volume about understanding the New Testament history, culture, and society. For this part 2 of Why Religion, Professor Blumell moves more into why some of this scholarship matters, honing in more specifically on the King James Version translation and how Latter-day Saints can approach the King James Version of the New Testament. So here's Ryan Sharp continuing his interview with Dr. Blumell.
As I thought about what would be most useful for our listeners, I thought it would be good to hone in on one of your areas of expertise and allow you to provide your own unique training and perspective. So in this volume, you co-authored a piece with Dr. Jan Martin here, a colleague of ours, on the King James translation of the Bible. And in that chapter, you wrote, even though many of the KJV translators were excellent scholars in their own right and relied on some of the best scholarly tools available in their day, the translation sometimes falls short of accurately conveying the sense of the underlying Greek, as it is easy to miss every idiom, subtlety, and nuance. So accordingly, you provide a list of 50 instances where the KJV may benefit from either a slight correction or a revision. I'm curious, of that list of 50, do you have one or two or three that stand out to you and that you think may be of particular interest for our listeners?
Yeah, there are a few, and I should just begin this by saying, I picked 50. I probably could have picked, 400.
Yeah.
And this is not, again, to belittle the translators, but because you can always, do it this way or that way with the word or something. But these were a few places where, some cases the translation is okay, but it really misses what's going on. There are a few cases where they just got the translation wrong. And so one of the ones that I think is useful, it's on the list I have there at the back, it's number 12. It's for Luke 4:13. And the KJ reads, "And when the devil had ended all the temptation, he departed from him for a season." And this Greek word is this word kairos. It can mean a time, like as I put here, a season. But really, it's a certain meaning. There's a few different words in Greek for time. And this one means until really the right time, like the opportune time. And so I think it's much better to say, basically, he departed, from Jesus until there was the opportune time. And I think that would really, I think, resonate with members. And when we think about how, the adversary works, well, okay, he goes for a time, but he's going to look for when's a good time to come back? When's the opportune time? And so I think that probably, not only I think it's more faithful to the Greek, but it probably gives you a different sense. We'll just go for a time and it'll come back kind of at random. But no, that's actually deliberate.
Kind of the strategy of
There's a strategy there. When's there going to be an opportune time? And so, and so I think there's something more there that we can get with understanding the meaning there.
Maybe just one or two others, Lincoln, that you really liked here.
Yeah, well, there's one, number 16. It's John 20:17. This is a very tender moment after the resurrection, right, where Mary Magdalene comes to Jesus. This is on the early morning, right, on Sunday morning. And she's looking for him, and she sees, what she believes is the gardener there, and asking, where have you laid my Lord? And then you have, in this kind of brief dialogue, you then have Jesus telling her in John 20:17, Jesus saith unto her, "Touch me not, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say unto them, I ascend unto my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." And something here that I've often heard this described is that she wasn't allowed to touch him, right? Only the Father be the first one to touch Jesus. But in Greek, it's a command. We have two kinds of commands. There's an active command, well, don't do something. And here this is a middle imperative, which means you're already doing the action. And so when he says basically, touch me not, he's basically saying, stop holding on to me. It's more or less, I need to go now to my Father. And so it clearly kind of figures this, where it's actually a very tender moment. If you actually go over and read, in Matthew 28, verse 7, it's very clear she's actually held him. And so the way I imagine this is going on is that when she recognizes him, she goes and falls down at him and grabs him. And at some point, Jesus saying, okay, stop holding me. I need to go to my Father now, but go and tell the disciples. And so it's really a rather tender moment where I think with this translation, I should note here, there's actually is a JST here, which does kind of get more to this sense that the holding's actually going on, or the touching. But yeah, I imagine this beautiful thing where she's grabbing him, clutching him, and saying, okay, it's time that I need to go now, instead of that she's not touching him at all. So the Greek actually makes it clear that, in fact, the holding's actually in process as it's going on, and not that she's not even allowed to even touch him.
Yeah.
But it's going on. But yeah, it's really quite beautiful.
Yeah, I think that does change the reading of that text. Let me ask a couple of questions with this, because for those of us who don't read Greek and have not been trained in Paparology, two questions. One, where can we go to be able to find maybe some of these insights? And then number two, what do you think is the value for Latter-day Saints to spend the time digging into some of these and looking at the original Greek?
Well, I guess for resources, hopefully some might turn to this book as a first resource. I would also say, there are, some good modern translations that people can go to that have, good study notes, things like that people can go to. A lot of them are often posted even for free online. As I think here about studying, one of the things, I think we have a great example, right? If you go back to the beginnings of the church, Joseph Smith and others, right? He wanted to learn Hebrew. He was learning Hebrew. The early apostles spent time learning Hebrew, right? He also tried to learn some Greek and other languages, because I think there are, insights to be gleaned. I'll tell my class, I say, here's my take. When you read the New Testament in English, it's like watching a black and white, television show. When you read it in Greek or Hebrew, you're now watching it in high definition, because there's words, right, that kind of pop out to you. For example, often at least of the King James, they don't always translate the same word consistently. So when you read the Gospel of John or the Gospels and you read the word love, that is the Greek word agape, and it's kind of read as love. So, in the discourse on love at the Last Supper in John, 14 to 16, about loving one another, right? The intercessory prayer in John 17, well, they love one another. This is all this word. Well, you go over now to the Pauline epistles, the translators now take that same word and render it as charity. And so when you read 1 Corinthians 13, Paul's discourse on charity, you can just easily translate as his discourse on love. And I think it's a certain kind of love. I don't want to say that charity is a mistranslation or that love's a mistranslation, but I think there's things you're saying, they're talking about the same thing. It's not, well, there's charity over there and there's love over there. No, it's the same concept. And so I think sometimes by looking at some of these insights, you'll make connections you don't otherwise make. I notice when I read Greek, I'll notice things and say, I didn't notice that for the first time. It actually says this, and it says something similar back over here, where the English doesn't always capture that. Yeah. And so I think there's some things, or with words, words carry, certain kind of meaning that kind of gets overlaid, right? We talk about baptism today, right? Well, we don't know baptism, but the Greek word baptizo, it means washing. John's out there washing people, and so there's a time of making somebody clean. And so there's things like that I think if you do spend a little bit of time, you don't have to become great in philology and understand all these words. But I think looking up, maybe some dictionaries, some words, online tools, it can really help sometimes if you want to get in a bit more advanced scripture study.
If you're interested in reading Professor Blumell's edited volume on the New Testament, history, culture, and society, a background to the texts of the New Testament, we've included a link to that publication at whyreligion.byu.edu. And remember that if you want to connect with us at Why Religion, comment and give some insights on episodes you've listened to, see behind-the-scenes photos, and get some bonus material, follow us on Instagram at Why Religion Podcast. That's at Why Religion Podcast. Okay, we've arrived at our final segment of this episode for Why Religion, Part 3, where we like to talk with the professor about why the professor chose to be a religious educator, why they believe, and why they choose faith. So we wrap up this episode with Lincoln Blumell sharing a little bit about his academic and faith journey.
This last section, what we like to do is try to understand you a little bit better and your background. So maybe let's jump to your academic training. What's your PhD in, and why did you pick that field?
So I did a PhD in religious studies at the University of Toronto, and elsewhere I went to the University of Calgary and to Oxford. And all my training was in religious studies or in classics. I started off in classical studies, really because it became very clear to me in religious studies, a problem with religious studies I see when it comes to biblical studies is a lack of language training. And for me, I'm like, if you really want to understand the text, let's not rely on translation. Let's actually read the text ourselves. And so that's why I thought classics, and often a lot of what I did, even at my PhD level, was often in classics also, was driven because I thought language was really important, really getting into the text, and then also working on a lot of the history of the text.
Let's build on that then. So how does a young Canadian who loves hockey, who played college football, end up in paparology and as a professor at BYU in religious education?
Well, yeah, good question. I would say it really started back to my mission. Before my mission, I probably like a lot of, youth. Yeah, seminary was fine. I did early morning seminary. It was tough getting up there, but it was okay. But really, I started a mission in London, England, and it was really when I really got there and quickly realized how little I actually knew. Actually served in an area not far from Oxford, and other areas, and quickly realized, wow, I really don't know this as well as I should. And so I really got into it then. And it was, kind of being in London with bookstores and everything like this, you can get about any book you want, began really kind of digging into it on my mission. Then I came back after my mission. I still wasn't sure I was going to get into something ancient, but I was at another university and thought, wow, you can take a class on the Bible. I had no idea you could take a class on the Bible at university. So I took a class, and it was totally different from what you would expect, obviously, in seminary or, Gospel Doctrine Institute, but it really fascinated me. And so kind of one class led to another. And I thought, wow, you can take ancient Greek at university. well, I would love to know the language of the New Testament. And so began taking Greek and Hebrew and things like that, and really got into it, did an undergraduate degree, did a first master's, a second master's. And then, of course, I couldn't stop. And then ultimately did the PhD. And what really got me going with ancient texts is when I did a master's at Oxford, they, of course, have, in their library all kinds of manuscripts. They have a very large collection of papyri from a city in Egypt called Oxyrhynchus that I've done a number of work on since. And I remember the first time going in there and having somebody, pull out and show me, here is the earliest fragment of this book of the New Testament that's known in existence today. And it's just like, wow. Right there on this, little piece of, papyrus that, is about maybe like a 3x5 card is, some passage from the Gospel of Matthew. And it was just so interesting that I began getting into this and realizing that there were tens and tens of fragments, tens and tens of thousands, and probably around the world, hundreds of thousands of fragments that have never been published. And I thought, I wonder what's, on these, and start reading them. And I've actually found the New Testament fragment. In fact, just a little while ago, I just translated, it's not published yet, not for public knowledge, among the two earliest fragments from the Gospel of Luke that actually have variants for Luke chapter 2 and Luke chapter 24 that are, right as of now, unknown.
Now, you were at Tulsa before this?
Toronto. Oh, I taught at Tulane University in New Orleans.
And so you taught at Tulane, and then you made the jump here to BYU and are teaching here in religious education. So maybe let me ask one or two final questions here. As somebody who has dealt extensively with the original, with early manuscripts, with the papyri, with the ancient Greek, there are a number of people who, and many scholars who delve into this, and sometimes, some sadly lose their faith in the divinity of the Savior. I received an email just last night from a mother who was concerned when her son learned about potential authorship questions and things like that. So as a scholar and as a scholar researching ancient texts, why do you choose to believe? What is it that helps you believe in the divinity of Jesus and in the restoration?
Well, one of the things, I did notice, that people kind of, as they go through, right, this kind of academic journey, there are people that kind of start off, and not just Latter-day Saints, but others of other, Christian faiths that start off as believers and come out, totally unbelieving of everything. I think for me, a couple things that are really, that I keep in mind, where I felt I had more questions, but my faith was largely enriched. I would say, first of all, one of the things we have said is we've said from the start, say, look, the text of the Scriptures is not infallible, right? It's not inerrant. There are problems in the text history. That's one of the things right from the start. Joe Smith is making claims like this, and I remember working with people early on that came maybe from a Protestant notion of where the text, in some Protestant traditions, it's fixed, it hasn't been altered, it's there. And this does cause them some real concerns when they learn about variants. Maybe the reading we have is not right. And for me, it was like, yeah, you'd expect some of this stuff to happen. That's why the restoration is needed. But yeah, these are some things that I've kind of got in the manuscripts. I certainly see some things differently than it is often portrayed maybe in your standard text.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Finally, any final words of testimony or how this project has deepened your faith?
Yeah, I think, for me, and this is maybe goes back, you mentioned I taught at Tulane before I came here, and that was a wonderful experience. There I was in the classics department, and I was there kind of over early Christianity. And I had a great experience there. But one of the things that I've loved about coming to BYU that relate to this is there, I'm just a historian. Let's just talk about the text and the history and things like that. And I did find when I taught New Testament there were a number of students, that it came from faith backgrounds, and they wanted something a little bit more. And I understand in that university, right in that environment, no, we're going to treat it like a religious studies model. One thing I love coming here is I think I get the best of both worlds. I can go in, I can give some background, some context, do some philology, but then I get to tell students, hey, look, here's what it can mean for you as you want to be a disciple of Christ. It's one thing to talk about, okay, well, early Christians talk about love. Let's compare the kind of love they talk about to other kinds of love that exist in the ancient world. where, okay, what does that mean to you to really love somebody or to love an enemy? And how can we, become better disciples of Christ? How can we really, try to follow him? Where for me, I really love that here is it's not just kind of I'm a distant historian, but you can actually become better disciples, better people. It can change your life.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of religious education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat. I'm the executive producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes from Brigham Young University Professors Brad Wilcox, Casey Griffiths, and Ryan Sharp. Recording and mixing were done by BYU students Mitchell Bashford and Connor Miller. Say hi, Mitchell and Connor.
Hey guys.
Hi.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and
Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.